Matt Kaiser, welcome to the Wade Champions podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'm super excited to talk about a topic that is definitely at the forefront in the minds of many of our listeners, many of our coaches, and that is the world of safe sport and how to navigate that as a coach. As I said in the introduction, we met at the American Swim Coaches Association World Summit, and you had done a talk on the safe sport scaries, but maybe you can give a little bit of your background, tell people who you are, what your firm does, and all that before we dive in here, because we'll touch briefly on some of the anti-doping stuff as well. So why don't you fire away and let people know who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I work at Global Sports Advocates. I've been an attorney there for going on 7 years at this point. Went to Villanova for law school. Before that, went to William and Mary for undergrad. So kind of stayed on the East Coast for my education. Went overseas to Spain to get a master's in international sports law, and that's how I met my boss, Paul Green, who founded Global Sports Advocates. And we're, I would say, one of the few uh, international sports law firms that handle anti-doping cases, governance issues for a lot of the national governing bodies and international federations. And then, as you brought up and how we met, also handle a lot of safe sport issues within the U.S. So we span the gamut, basically anything you see related to regulations. Be it internationally or nationally, including the NCAA, we probably have our fingers involved with it.
And I was fascinated to learn. I think you're only one of two law firms in the U.S. that does this type of work. Was that correct? Or the
Yeah,
world? Yeah.
in the U.S., there's one on the West Coast and one that we specialize in anti-doping, and yeah, there's a couple internationally as well. But yeah, it's definitely a select few that are able to handle those cases, and we've had pretty good success and have made some waves in the anti-doping sphere, which have gotten us a lot of cases moving forward. So it's pretty exciting.
Well, let's start there because let me actually start before that and just say, like, what got you interested in this aspect of international sports law? Because heck, you could have been a player agent and made gazillions of dollars. No.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, growing up in the US, everyone's inundated with the 4 or 5 major professional sports leagues in the US: MLS, NFL, NHL, NBA, and MLB. But you don't really hear much about the Olympics except, once every 2 years with the winter and then alternating with the summer. So I didn't really know there was this field of work available going through law school. I knew I love sports. I've always played sports growing up, soccer and baseball primarily. Played club baseball at William and Mary. So, I have a deep passion and interest. I realized pretty quickly I wasn't going to be on the field
hmm
professionally. So I
hmm
try to use my other asset of my brain to stay in the area and work kind of behind the scenes and hopefully get in front offices. And that was the real motivation for going to law school. Was a lot of the people in the C-suite level executives had JD backgrounds. So my parents said, well, clearly you have to go to law school and get a
hmm
degree.
hmm
And from there, I networked with a lot of my professors, and one of them said, "Hey, I know you're doing your MBA as well. Do you think you can try to get an international sports law master's degree as on top of it?" I said, "Sure, why not?" They knew my passion and interest for sports, and so that's how I ended up in Spain for my final semester at Villanova. And found that whole opened up a whole new world of anti-doping and just overall how these international sports are regulated more in a pyramid scheme with the international federation and then all these national governing bodies organizing and managing the sport internally within their country. So that opened my eyes to the anti-doping world and opened my eyes to this international sports law field, and kind of that's how I met my boss. He was actually one of our professors for a couple days, so we networked and I interned with him and ended up staying there for 7 years now.
That's awesome, man. It's such a cool story and such a cool field. So starting just a bit with some of the anti-doping stuff, because um I think in the world of sports now, usually when people are accused, the automatic assumption is, well, you're guilty, and a lot of people are. But you guys, I mean, you just used the word sort of pyramid scheme. There's so many different layers and levels, and anyone who looks at the IOC or FIFA or any world governing bodies knows how much politics is behind certain decisions as well. Geopolitics even is behind decisions. So your advocacy a lot is people that obviously you believe are falsely accused or have gotten. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, you have intentional cheaters. They're always out there trying to beat the system. I think we do a good job vetting the individuals who call our firm to one, make sure they're not trying to pull one over on us. And if we do, somehow assess that out, we drop them as a client immediately and
Mm-hmm.
say we don't handle that type of cases, and we take pride in our reputation that we have internationally and with the opposing counsels. So we'd never want to ruin it on a single athlete.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the athletes that come to us are basically one of two categories. You have falsely accused, the testing is done incorrectly and it's a false positive, or it's in their system. There's no way around it. The issue is just let's try to get the lowest sanction possible. So
Mm-hmm.
those are the two main situations that we face. Of course, there's a third branch of whereabouts failures, which I can go into detail, but generally speaking, it's the upper echelon athletes, like 1% in the country in their sport, have to fill out where they will be 1 hour every day so that they can get randomly tested. And sometimes if you miss where you are and they come to test you, or you don't accurately, describe where you'll be so that they can come test you, you'll get a strike. And three strikes within a 12-month period mean you would get almost a year to 2 year ban. So
Mm-hmm.
we handle those cases as well.
I mean, that's like a scary thing for the normal person to be like, yeah, oh yeah, let's go out to dinner quick, and you sort of like have a conversation, and then you're like, oh my God, I messed up the fact that I was supposed to be home from 6 to 7 p.m., right?
It's funny you say that because that's so many of the cases where they go to see a movie theater down the street, or to your point, go out to dinner and they get a call from the doping control officer saying, "Hey, I'm at your door. Where are you?" And they're a half hour away or 20 minutes away and they can't get back in time. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a high burden that a lot of that the international sports law rules and anti-doping rules put on athletes. Um, Whether that's fair or not is a different story, but that's just the burden that they carry to operate at that high level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting, I think people should realize, right, that the history of the anti-doping movement. I mean, there was this book, I think it's called Spitting in the Soup or whatever, right? Which is the history of it. And I mean, this has been going on for ages, right? And
Yeah.
this is not a new thing in the last 20 years or 40 years. I mean, it's been good. People have always been looking for an edge. And it's like, so there is those athletes that are staying one step ahead of what you can test. But I mean, you were telling me like the sensitivity of the testing is incredible now. I think there was some analogy of a swimming pool, but maybe you can sort of tell me that if that jogs your memory.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the World Anti-Doping Code was developed and World Anti-Doping Agency was developed in the wake of the Festina affair, which is the huge cycling doping scandal. And so, ever since then, which was the late 90s, they've been constantly trying to develop a system where they're able to detect metabolites longer. They're able to detect new substances that may be being used by athletes to gain an advantage. And we're getting to the point now where you're testing positive at levels that are what are called picogram levels, and that's a picogram is basically the ability to detect a dash of salt in an Olympic sized swimming pool. Like that's how sensitive and how low these labs are able to detect. And so when you're testing at that low level, the problem for the athlete, because the athletes put on defense and they're the ones that have to prove where it came from, is it really could have come from anywhere. We've had cases where they eat, non-organic beef and they test positive because the FDA allows a lot of the steroids to be injected into the cows. you have sex contamination, you have water contamination. Supplements, of course, are a huge risk. But you name it, it can come from almost everywhere. We've had kissing cases as well. So yeah, it just broadens the scope of what you need to look at and inquire with your potential client about of what they were doing in the lead up to the test. So it makes it definitely a lot more challenging to find the source.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that like you're dating someone and you're like, oh, hold on before we date. Are you eating organic food? Are you, do you have any sort of thing that you're taking medication for that I need to know about? Right? It's crazy.
Yeah, there's a famous case called Gasquet versus ITF, and he was out, at the clubs one night and just hooked up with a random person who ended up being a cocaine addict and had taken it at some point during the night, and science was able to support his theory that he just got it when hooking up with the individual. So we've had a couple of our own cases similar to that. We've had ones with boyfriends taking steroids unbeknownst to the professional athlete female and having unprotected sex and then getting tested and the residues left over and they test positive. So
Wow.
it's pretty wild. I mean, I didn't expect to use so much science coming out of law school,
Yeah.
but I've become like a part-time, doctor as and as part of the legal field.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm for sure. Now, one of the other things you talked about is lab error, and that's something that we don't think like, oh, that's not, but that's actually a big part of it, right? Like when your testing is that sensitive, the tiniest little issue with lab cleaning can all of a sudden lead to positive. And I know you've had cases like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, one of the more recent ones that we've had is Peter Bowl case down in Australia, and that you know EPA. So there's certain prohibited substances that are naturally formed in your body. Think of testosterone.
Hmm.
One that's very common is EPO as well.
Hmm.
And if you want to maliciously use it, you get injections of synthetic EPO to increase blood flow and oxygen to your body. Um, but the test to detect it is very subjective in what level of what's called a smear or like growth. Think of it as the watercolor where you drop a paint of blue on a white page and it kind of spreads out. So the way they measure whether or not you're taking synthetic EPO is there a high concentration the farther you get away from the drop, the center of the drop. And so, there's a lot of subjectivity associated with that test. And with the Peter Bowl case, he was originally said to have tested positive. We had some experts explain why the testing that was done was consistent with overloading the sample. So if you put a darker color or hold your paintbrush longer on the white sheet of paper, you'll have a darker hue,
Hmm.
and that can be misinterpreted as being part of synthetic EPO as opposed to just your natural EPO. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, fortunately, it's very rare when it does happen, but it is not impossible, and we've had cases where it does happen.
Yeah, and I mean, sadly, the reputational damage is almost always done, right? And when any athlete in any sport tests guilty these days, everyone's like, well, yeah, of course they're doping, right? Like, and so when I can't imagine the panic and the anxiety and the just the I don't know, the struggle with fairness, right? Of that someone feels when they're like, no, no, because we know that there's organized doping programs out there and it's an uneven playing field in many sports, for countries. And then when you're not doing it and you're getting accused, I mean, that just must be the most horrible thing.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a mental toll on these athletes. One, because they pride themselves on being clean. They take extensive precautions to make sure nothing, unusual goes into their system. And then when they do test positive, it's their whole world comes crashing down. And unfortunately, kind of like Safesport, where you hear the word doping, you hear Safesport, everyone immediately assumes guilt
Mm-hmm.
and that it's the worst thing happen. And unfortunately, the way the system is now, USADA does a good job. They don't publicly announce even the A sample or B sample or afterwards that you've been provisionally suspended until the case is completely resolved. That way, you don't have any prejudgment from the media or scrutiny. A lot of these international federations announce it either after the first the A sample or after the B sample confirms it, and where your backs are against the wall, all your sponsors start to question you and pull out, and it's just it's not a good situation for the athlete to be in for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, for so many of these athletes, without a sponsor, they can't afford to do their sport or whatever. So, yeah, those sponsors don't want their name associated with it. Now, we just had this in the last Winter Olympics. We had this famous case with a Russian figure skater,
Mhm.
which then threw another twist on it because she was so young. Their decision in the moment was, well, she should be allowed to compete because she was too young to make that decision herself. Am I stating that correctly?
Yeah, so they basically said there's a gap in the way the World Anti-Doping Code is written, and it doesn't specifically address whether minors can get out of a provisional suspension and be able to compete while the case is pending, even though they tested positive for a substance where if you're an adult, you wouldn't have the ability to have the suspension lifted while the case plays out. So, you know, unfortunately for her, clearly with all the media scrutiny and drama, it affected her and her ability to perform,
Yeah.
even though it was in her favor at the end. So you kind of feel bad in that situation as well.
Yeah.
It's never easy thing.
Oh yeah, no, that was hard. I mean, you had to feel for a 15-year-old girl, I think she was, right?
Yeah.
I mean, never mind the pressure and the scrutiny of being in the Olympics.
Mhm.
Then you throw in all this other stuff and people accusing you of this or that. I mean, my God, it was terrible. All right, let's shift gears into the safe sport realm. Well, at the American Swim Coach Association, your talk was entitled "The Safe Sport Scaries." So talk about that. What was the purpose of your talk there? Because I thought it was really interesting.
Sure. So, the term safe sport, as I said, you initially get the connotation that, hey, this is a terrible thing. It was, the Safe Sport United Center, U.S. Center for Safe Sport was created in the wake of the Larry Nassar scandal. So everyone assumes when there is a safe sport violation, it's the worst, most egregious violation possible,
Right.
sexual misconduct.
And for
Um,
those who are not from the United States, Larry Nassar was the doctor from Michigan State who was treating many of the U.S. gymnasts. Just in case people don't know who that was.
Yeah, no, good point. And so, I mean, he's in jail now, but the center was created to try to be an oversight to the Olympic movement so that things didn't get pushed under the rug by the individual national governing bodies or by the USOPC because it was an elite athlete or elite coach who got in trouble and not just brush everything under the rug. So the Safe Sports Scaries, over the last couple of years, the code has developed to incorporate a lot more, I would say, activity and conduct that coaches don't really realize initially may be a safe sport violation, and that could lead them to hopefully no violation, but a reprimand, probation, all the way to some form of suspension. So my talk was explaining to them, what the kind of rudimentary things that they need to keep in mind when it comes to safe sport protocol, but also how to protect themselves and protect their club so that they aren't wrongly accused. Because we see that, unfortunately, more times than not, that while safe sport was originally created to be a shield to protect vulnerable athletes, young athletes, is now being used as a sword by parents, by athletes, by coaches when they don't get their way and disagree with the coach. And so simply filing a safe sport complaint can lead to a whole headache. So, my talk is to quell the anxiety and try to put some good practices in place for coaches to protect themselves.
I mean, I think one of the challenges with it is, like you said, there's a lot of behaviors that might have been okay 10 years ago, like
Mhm.
texting an athlete or something like that, that would fall under things that you're not supposed to do, and some of the reporting requirements as well. As a coach, as a mandatory reporter, or, what do you do? And so let's dive into some of those things, because again, there's a lot of good behind Safesport, right? The purpose of it was novel, and what was interesting was when they created it, Congress created it and then didn't fund it, right? And said, okay, all the sports governing bodies, you guys now have to fund this thing. And if you don't fund it and you screw up, we're of course going to use it for publicity to destroy you. And so that was the most, interesting thing. And I remember in the first year of it, when they were first rolling out their sort of mandatory courses, I was on the speaking circuit with some Safesport people who were like, we have a standing job offer for investigators, because at that point they had like 8 investigators and 1,000 cases. And now I don't even know how many cases they have, but like there's no way they could investigate everything. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's for everything good that Safesport stands for. The biggest problem we see is just the backlog that they have and under resource situation that they're facing. We have cases. I have a case right now that's been over 2 years of just waiting for a final determination. We've had cases where the coach is aware a complaint has been filed, but it takes 3 months for them to actually get a notice from the Safesport Center of Safesport. Now, there's a lot behind the scenes that has to be settled between the U.S. Center for Safesport and the national governing body as to who has jurisdiction, who's going to do the investigation, et cetera, et cetera. But generally speaking, it definitely is a slower timeline than would be appreciated or desired in order to have both for both victims and respondents, where they want a final solution or final resolution to their case, and one way or another. So it keeps a lot of the victims in limbo, keeps the respondents in limbo. So it's unfortunately just the lack of resources just puts them behind the 8 ball a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm. Now, I read, I don't know, maybe it was a month ago or so, Cindy Parlow-Cohn, who's the
Mhm.
president of U.S. Soccer, had an article in USA Today about their frustration with this, because somewhere buried in the law, and maybe you could explain it more, is that if Safesport takes up a case, the national governing body isn't allowed to do anything. So in her article, she wrote, there's multiple coaches that have been named in this Yates report about the systemic abuse in women's soccer. And Safesport is still, quote, investigating. And so these people are still coaching, even though U.S. Soccer is saying, you know what, we'd like to at least preliminarily suspend them
Mhm.
pending this. But no, we can't do that, because once Safesport takes it up, we're out of the loop. So explain that a little bit, because that seems to be a little like, I don't know. I can see both sides of it for sure.
Yeah. So basically, the way Safesport structured is that there's a group of claims or violations that fall under Safesport's exclusive jurisdiction. That's the sexual misconduct, that's child abuse, that's most of the time, the more egregious misconducts under the code. Also, abuse of process, failure to report, and trying to intimidate witnesses one way or another not to file a report. So those, if the incident falls under those types of categories, then Safesport has exclusive jurisdiction, meaning, and Ms. Parlow-Cohn is right, where the NGB just is hands off. They can't do anything. But they're basically beholden to whatever Safesport does, and that's both in terms of temporary measures that they may or may not impose, and then also the final sanction. So the NGB can't do its own investigation. They can't impose a temporary measure until at any point, because ultimately it's in Safesport's court as to what they feel is appropriate. So there are situations where, I mean, Safesport has the ability and just really a lot of discretion of whether or not they impose a temporary measure. So if they don't feel that it's necessary to impose a temporary measure, likely it isn't one of the more quote unquote heinous situations, and it may be more of either misunderstanding or I would say less severity situations. So
Mhm.
they're beholden to Safesport. The Safesport takes its time to do its own investigation, which can be frustrating for the NGB as well.
Mhm.
And they may want to take, super, uh, be super
Mhm.
cautious about the situation and want to suspend everyone until a final resolution. From our perspective, that's not always fair. I mean,
Yeah.
coaches can get incorrectly charged or accused of wrongdoing, and then have to suffer by being forced to sit out. Now, there's a spectrum of temporary measures that Safe Sport can impose, where you always have another adult around. You have to, you can't go to certain scheduled events. You can't have any contact order with certain people. So there is a lot of discretion and room for ensuring the safety of the athletes, which is ultimately the purpose of the safe sport.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's, again, to me, it's very fascinating, like, because you're exactly right. Because it would be very easy politically and structurally for an NGB to be trigger happy and be like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, there's a complaint, you're suspended. Right. And then, for all the people who are innocent, that's the problem, is that they might have just lost their livelihood,
Yeah.
trying to do this. And then the problem on the opposite end of the spectrum, like you said, is Safe Sport is so understaffed and underfunded that things take so long to go through. Is that unfair to the athletes or the NGB of like, hey, we're trying to protect people from this? And it's not like, you know, a court system where there's judges and attorneys and we deal with this in a speedy manner. And that's
Yeah.
the problem, right? Is how do you rectify those two polar opposite positions sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, the problem, or I guess the way this safe sport is structured is they do an investigation. The people who do the investigation write up a report that's sent up to the attorneys of safe sport, and they're the ones that ultimately, as a group, decide, was a violation committed, what's an appropriate sanction under the circumstances, and then they um, offer or decide this is your suspension. You can now appeal it to an arbitrator and third party arbitrator, but either take it or go fight and spend more money trying
Mm-hmm.
to appeal it. So yeah, it's definitely a difficult situation for all stakeholders to be involved in. I mean, I'm sure Safesport would prefer to be able to be more
Yeah.
expeditious on this and finish these results much quicker and get the fair results needed. But yeah, they're just in a bad situation with staffing issues and under resourced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then now we go into the next phase. I think there was some pushback, and I don't know if it was in Parlo Cohn's letter or just around that time, where someone just said, "Oh well, Safesport administratively dismisses X percentage of cases," right? And it seems like a really high amount, but potentially a lot of these claims are things that aren't really under their purview or that they are going to investigate. So they're not sexual abuse, they're not physical harm, they're not these things. And I think a lot of them are this sort of potential weaponization of safe sport as well. Oh, let me get my kid's coach out of the way because
Mhm.
she's not a starter and whatever. And anyone who thinks this is not happening is just being naive right now, because I hear these stories, as I'm sure you do, all the time.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the problem with having such access to SafeSport. Anyone can submit an anonymous claim. Anyone, not even the victim, can submit on behalf of the victim, hey, something did happen. And so you're getting complaints from, I've had individuals tell me they filed SafeSport complaints because they wanted to get money back from the, private program that they've
Yeah, they signed their kid
send
up. They
their
didn't
kids
like
to.
it. They wouldn't get
Yeah.
a refund, so they file a safe sport complaint.
Yep. And so I mean, that's not the purpose, and we absolutely don't condone that. So, but to your point, I mean, you're naive if you don't think that that happens behind the scenes. So it's an unfortunate byproduct of just how the system and being overly cautious works. But you know, the number of cases that get dismissed shouldn't scare or be concerning to anyone, because as you said, sometimes it just doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of Safesport. Sometimes it's a frivolous claim, like what I just explained, and it's more of a dispute between whether or not a kid starts, as opposed to actually a safe sport issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And and then and a lot of times when they dismiss it, it actually just gets dismissed back to the local governing body. Not local, but this right. So it would go back to US Soccer, or it would go back to USA Swimming, who then might put it out to the state soccer association or the local swim committee or something like that, correct?
Well, I mean, that shouldn't happen, because basically Safesport has made the determination that this isn't a viable Safesport complaint. So we can't handle it. And that means not that because they can exercise what's called discretionary jurisdiction. If they want to take a case, they can.
Right.
Otherwise, that they'll kick it back to the national governing body or local club for them to handle. But that's not dismissing the case.
Right.
Dismissing the case is basically saying, hey, we haven't found that there's any wrongdoing, or there's not even a corroborating witness or any evidence to support the claim.
Right.
So,
Right.
those
So
cases,
those are
if they get
different.
dismissed, yeah, if they get dismissed, that's basically a binding effect from my perspective of everyone needs to say they can't do anything else, because that was decided that there's nothing there.
Right. And that is an interesting point, that it is a binding thing. So if Safe Sport makes a decision and says nothing happened here, the national governing body can't do anything about it at that point, right? Like
Mhm.
that's a binding decision on them as well.
Yeah, I mean, some NGBs have taken the perspective that they can go above and beyond, and impose their own sanctions. But in my opinion, that's not how the Safe Sport was structured and how it works. They're beholden to what Safe Sport decides.
Right, right. All right. So now what is, I mean, your advice to coaches, but because like you said, if someone makes this complaint, like, you know, completely false, that they want their money back, so they make a complaint about a coach, or they don't like their kid's coach because their kid's not a starter anymore or whatever. The problem is that there's not a lot of repercussions for that complaint, whether it's anonymous or not, correct? Like a false complaint, there's no repercussions for making that, is there? Unless you can show
Right.
malice, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, there's two problems that always kind of come up. Is one, is the person who's even making the complaint subject to the rules of the Safe Sport Code? So if you just have a random parent who isn't a member of USA Swimming or USA Taekwondo, for example, and they make a malicious complaint, Safe Sport can't do anything about it, because
Mm-hmm.
they have no jurisdiction over them.
Mm-hmm.
The other issue is, as you said, it's really hard to prove that someone did it out of bad faith. And they can say, "Oh, I saw the coach yelling at my kid or saying using profanity," and that's a legitimate, safe sport complaint. But whether or not they're actually doing it for the safety of their child versus, hey, we're planning to switch teams and you're not letting my kid leave, I'm going to file a safe sport complaint so that it forces you to let us go.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be, unless you have a smoking gun of a text message or email, something that says that, you're never going to be able to prove that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the hard part, because a coach might end up having to hire you, pay legal fees, go through this process to clear his or her name, and then there's no repercussions to the person who filed that complaint in the first place.
Yep.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's the situation.
God, it's tough. So what is some of your specific advice? I mean, because like my worry um is that we talk a lot right now in this country about the referee shortage. And we can't get officials because of the abuse that officials across all sports are taking. But I truly believe that there is a coaching shortage coming. And that coaching shortage is coming because, I mean, most coaches are volunteers anyway. Um, even those who get paid most, right? It's covers their travel or their kid's fee or something, right? There's not, it's, and then there's the percentage of people who make a living in this space, but it's like they put themselves out there and they risk their whole family's reputation, financial future, all this sort of stuff, um, to volunteer for the local little league.
Yeah, I always joke with the coaches that I talk to, is like, I would never want to be a coach that, in this day and age. It's just so much pressure, so much scrutiny, and any misstep on your part can be misconstrued as a safe sport violation. We've had coaches who are overly celebratory with their athletes, hugging them, bringing them in close, and they get accused of excessive hugging and physical contact, and that's a safe sport violation. So it's definitely a precarious situation to put yourself in and put your family in. And I respect a lot of people who want to do it because they love the sport and love giving back to the kids. It's just definitely not something that I'd be interested in doing at this point.
It's scary. I mean, but what you just said, and obviously your what you hear is slightly skewed because you hear the bad stuff all day long, right?
Yeah.
If you're an oncologist, all you meet is people with cancer, right?
Mhm.
So it's like, not everyone has cancer, right? So there's obviously these amazing things, and everyone who listens to this, and myself included, loves coaching for the kids, for the relationships that you build, for helping them out, right? I'm getting pictures the other day from two of my players playing against each other in college and stuff like that. Like, and just the thank yous of thanks for helping us get here. Like that kind of stuff is incredible,
Mhm.
and you don't want to do that. But I mean, I wrote it down. Like I would never want to be a coach in this day and age because there's so much risk to my family and to our finances if one parent goes off the rails.
Yep. It's trying to be, you know, uh, appease everyone, and you won't ever be able to do that. And especially with the mentality of certain parents, if they feel entitled and that their kid should be a superstar, and for whatever reason they're not playing, uh, it just spirals down very quickly. So it's a very sad situation. I think there is going to be a dearth of coaches at some point, just because no one wants that headache. There's just really no reason for it.
Yeah. So what is your specific advice? What do I do as a coach to really protect myself the best I can?
Sure. So, I mean, this is just from my experience working with coaches who have gotten in trouble, and we've worked with it to resolve the case. But, first and foremost, always have a buddy with you, another coach, independent person who could vouch for what was said or not said. A lot of times, coaches get in trouble for their tone or way they spoke at an athlete during practice, if they're angry at them or if they're teasing them, and it can be misconstrued as harassment or bullying or intimidation. So always have a third person with you, even if it's supposed to be on a one-on-one conversation to talk about an athlete's development, or with the parents in the room. I would always have someone on your side, meaning, someone you trust who could vouch for you that whatever may be alleged didn't happen, or give the truth as to how certain things were said and done. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really the first, and I would say easiest way to have some form of protection and safeguard your well-being and reputation.
Yeah.
The second one is, you know, a lot of the situations happen in corridors or rooms where there's no cameras. Always have some, security system in place that could also be objective evidence of, hey, I didn't touch them, I didn't push them. Even reading body language can help your case as to whether or not something was said angrily or attacking. So try to have a thorough security system in whatever club or gym or swimming pool that you may be involved in. I think that's a big issue that I've seen coaches regret not having put it in sooner.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, because it's especially these sports, ice hockey, swimming, things like that, where you're in a locker room,
Mhm.
right? Where that's kind of part of what you're doing is really interesting. It's in, I don't know when you were in Spain, how much time if you got out into like grassroots sports organizations, but like every soccer club in Spain at their training field has a locker room and showers, and the kids go in afterwards and they all take a shower, and someone usually like locks it and stays outside and whatever. But what's interesting is like there is the biggest opportunity for bullying, abuse, things like that, right? And yet if you talk to kids like who like went to Spain for a while and then moved back to the States, that's what they miss the most. Sort of like the camaraderie of the locker room.
Absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, growing up, I mean, myself included, I mean, it was more of, hey, you get to goof off a little bit with your friends. Unfortunately, I've had cases where the shenanigans gets a little bit too far and, lack of judgment is prevalent. But at the same time, you're dealing with kids who are 12, 13, 14 years old. They're going to
Lack
make
of judgment
mistakes.
is always
I
prevalent.
know, and
Yeah.
it's hard treating them like adults when growing up, you're bound to make mistakes. The goal is for you to learn from them and not do that again. So we've had cases where, locker room behavior leads to a state sport violation, and my client got kicked out of school for a while, and so and again, it all comes down to how overreactive the victim is, or the parents of the victim sometimes says, I thought it was funny, or I thought it was, yeah, I was embarrassed, but everyone was laughing, and we were, I razz him as much as he razzes me. But the mom, who only hears it from the son's perspective for the first time, says this is totally inappropriate. I don't want my son humiliated like that. And they are the ones that file the safe sport complaint. So
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, that's crazy. All right. So from that perspective, what are some other specifics? I mean, I think about things like you said, like, you should never be in a car alone with a kid. And I think of all the times, practice ends early because it's like thunder and lightning and pouring rain. And there's kids left there, and I let them get in my car and I go stand under the tree to get hit by lightning because I'm not getting in a car with them,
yeah.
and that's the hard part is like, you know the humanity, do the right thing versus protect yourself you know
Yeah, it's always a fine line that you're walking. Limit as much one-on-one time as possible, and there's specific rules in place of, hey, if you're picking up a third party, make sure you have the consent of the parents in writing, that you can do so. I mean, sometimes you're just hanging out with friends, and I remember, I called my friends up at the last minute, like, hey, can you take me to your mom take me to practice? And she would. So it's definitely a very idealistic mentality to have, and program to have in place. But when you actually try to implement it, it's much more difficult and much more taxing on the coaches than it should be to
hmm
just bring a kid to practice. And but say sport rather be safe than sorry, and have too many hoops to jump through than not enough, and end
yeah.
up having a kid in a bad situation.
And so what's your advice to the coach who feel all of a sudden here comes this complaint, right? And
Mhm.
even if it's not safe sport, it's coming from their local governing body, regardless of sport, and all of a sudden you get blindsided by this email. What's your advice to them in that moment?
So, I mean, first is, I know it's going to be jarring, but don't panic. I would say most people get a notice of allegation just based on the fact that, hey, they do initial intake. They determine that if the facts are true, then it's a safe sport violation. That doesn't mean you're guilty or innocent or anything. It has no judgment on the merits. But the goal is to make sure that you're in a position to defend yourself properly. A lot of people think that they'll just go in to the interview and feel that they're okay and don't need to hire an attorney. And they run into a buzzsaw and they're not prepared for what questions can be asked, and they may unfortunately overshare unnecessarily and get themselves even in more trouble. So I would always recommend reaching out to a law firm to at least inform you of the next steps and process so that you can have a better idea of kind of the timeline of events, and unfortunately brace yourself that it's not going to be a quick resolution.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as you've seen many times, so many of these local governing bodies don't follow any sort of proper procedural things in terms of what they're calling evidence in a case, in terms of what they're, how they're setting up their quote hearing. All that
Yeah,
sort of stuff is like, would be immediately thrown out of a court of law, but in the kangaroo court of the local insert sport committee,
yeah.
right? You could lose your livelihood and your reputation.
Especially at the low level. I had a case this last year or earlier this year where, you know, the individual was accused of some safe sport violation. She was forced off the team or asked to leave for a while, and no one told her what she did or even what the specific misconduct was that she violated. And when she hired us, we pushed back, and the safe sport eventually the safe sport suspension got dropped, but now they said, oh, we're changing our mind and it's going to be a code of conduct violation that we have on our team. So they're always hiding the ball, and that's why it's really important for you to make sure you have legal counsel that can understand and kind of get through the fog that they're trying to, or sand that they're throwing in your face, to appease them. I mean, they have people that they answer to, boards that they answer to. So of course there's politics behind that of, hey, someone on the board may not have a kid that may not like the coach and they want to have the suspension till the end of the year, when legally and in a proper arbitration that doesn't even hold up. So
Right.
um, it's a lot of pushing to make sure that your rights are protected, because I think that's the biggest issue that can get overlooked or stomped on. And with a coach not having, you guys are coaches and not lawyers, so the purpose of hiring us is to make sure that the legal process is followed and your rights are protected and you're able to mount a proper defense so that your reputation isn't smeared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. So if you could wave your Matt Kaiser magic wand and make the process better and more fair for both ends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, none of this is dismissing the fact that there are horrible actions out there and horrible actors and very legitimate cases, right? And then there's some that are clearly not, and then there's a lot in the gray.
Mm-hmm.
If you could wave your magic wand, what could make it better tomorrow?
I think um, definitely having more of a timeline of events of when certain deadlines need to be met. One, the investigation needs to conclude. Yeah, you can always ask and interrogate or ask questions of someone new, and that prolongs it. But at some point, you have to decide one way or another: is this sufficient evidence to convict someone under the safe sport code? It shouldn't be a manhunt or a woman hunt to try to get someone in trouble. It's, hey, let's get to the truth.
Right, like let's drag it out until we find something.
Yeah, exactly. And so
Yeah.
that's the problem that, not that I have any, evidence or suggestion that that might be happening, but the longer anything takes to get a resolution, the more questions that you have, because sometimes you just don't know what else you can do. And I think the other aspect that could increase the fairness is when you get a notice of allegations, it's pretty generic. You get a general summary of when time frame wise the alleged incident occurred, and that's month and year or months and year. And then you have the general part of the safe sport code that you violated. So sexual misconduct, physical misconduct, harassment, bullying, but there's no details as to what you're being alleged to have done. And then the victim, their initials are are provided. So sometimes when you have a bunch of people coming forth, you may not even know some of the supposed victims to even be able to defend yourself. So um, I think those two biggest changes is having more of a timely response and investigation period, and also a more detailed notice of allegations so that you can defend yourself, because otherwise the first time that you actually get any notice of what the details could be is when you're in the interview with the Safesport investigator. And
Right.
that's at a disadvantage because, yes, they want to get the truth, and they don't, they want to try to not have you prepared so that they can catch you off guard. But at the same time, in order to defend yourself and have any context to provide them with evidence that something did or didn't happen, you have to have more details than generically, in March of
Yeah.
2019, this is what happened. Generally
Yeah.
a safe
Where
sport
were you?
violation happened. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. 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 God, it's so hard, man. I mean, it's obviously, I think this will sort itself out and the pendulum swings in both directions. But I worry for the future of coaching, which is such an important and impactful, I won't even call it a profession, vocation, right? People do it because they love it and they love kids, and a coach changed their life. And yet it's becoming a scarier and scarier proposition. And I know when we publish this, I'm going to get so many emails about this, right? Of like, right, let me tell you my story, because people share them with me all the time anyway. And I know I'll get more. And if we had some forum, I mean, the stories that would come out would probably be just crazy.
Yeah.
For both
I
good and
mean, it's
bad.
it's crazy on both ends. We represent
Both good
both
and bad.
victims and,
Yeah.
respondents. So again, there's some heinous people out there who take advantage of young athletes, and
Hmm.
it's despicable and very sad to be a part of and try to help the victim through. And the Safe Sport's there to protect them and make sure that justice is resolved. But at the same
Hmm.
time, you have to make sure the pendulum doesn't swing too far to automatically convict everyone or put them on, their heels whenever a Safe Sport complaint is filed, so that
Hmm.
they're, defending their reputation when otherwise they shouldn't be.
Hmm. 100%. Um, Matt, thank you so much for your time. How can people sort of connect with global sports advocates and stuff if, God forbid, they they need legal help right
Yeah.
now, but just for anything? I mean, it could be because their child's a victim.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Google us. It's Global Sports Advocates, and we're likely the first one to come up, or just go to globalsportsadvocates.com and you can see our intake page, see some success stories that we've had. And overall, feel free to reach out. Our number's there, our email is there as well, and happy to correspond and have an intake with anyone that may have any issues.
Well, listen, man, I truly appreciate you carving out the time for this. And, you go to these conferences and you're doing these talks for coaches and administrators and sport governing bodies. It's such important work that you guys are doing. And so, truly thank you for being on the Way Champions and sharing this. It's a topic we have not really addressed on this level. And I think it's a really important one. So thanks for your time today.
No problem. Happy to be here, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Way Champions podcast this week. This is your host, John O'Sullivan, and great podcast this week with Matthew Kaiser from Global Sports Advocates. They are law practice, practicing out of Portland, Maine, but their main area that they work with is in anti-doping and eligibility and safe sport. And I met Matt back in September. We were both speaking at the American Swim Coaches Association World Summit, and he had a talk entitled "The Safe Sport Scaries," and I thought I need to hear that, because I get a lot of emails and phone calls and stuff from coaches and from families talking about the system, which was put in place for obviously fantastic reasons. in the wake of the Larry Nassar scandal with USA Gymnastics, to protect the athletes, to protect victims, and to give a place where people can, file claims and protect themselves and get serial abusers out of sport. And that's Safesport at its very best and its purpose. And then we have the opposite, which is something that they've been aware of from day one. I remember going on the speaking tours with some of their speakers presenting it. And I said to them, "Are you worried about weaponization?" And they said, 100% we are. People who use Safesport as a way to get back at a coach they don't like or an organization that they don't like, and the challenges with that. And so, Matt is, he's a graduate of William and Mary and then a graduate of Villanova Law School. He also has his international sports law master's, which he received in Madrid, Spain. And he's been a full-time international sports attorney since 2017. He's been lead counsel before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, the International Tennis Federation, and numerous anti-doping cases and things like that. He's helped athletes switch their eligibility to different countries and so much more. And so in our talk today, we talk a little bit about anti-doping and everything that goes into that. But then we really spent a lot of time on this idea of Safesport and the Safesport Scaries and the reasons for it, and how coaches can protect themselves so that we use best practices as coaches so that we don't have to face false allegations. And if we do, what do we, that we have the ability to protect ourselves. And it's a fascinating conversation and a really important topic because as Matt stated in the podcast, as someone who grew up playing sports, and sports was a huge part of his life, he says, I would never want to be a coach in this day and age. And that's a scary thing to me because I think we're getting to that point where we're going to start losing great coaches because it's just not worth it. So we cover a lot of issues here, and I think you'll really, really enjoy this podcast and this topic that we haven't truly addressed at this level before on the podcast here. Before we jump in, I just want to thank all of our Patreon podcast champions. I want to thank our sponsors at Sprocket Sports who help us put out this podcast. All of you together help us put this out every single week, 340 something straight weeks here. It's been really incredible. And I just want to put that out there that if you are interested as the holidays come up here, if you want to get some bulk book orders of Every Moment Matters or Changing the Game or The Champion Teammate, which we've been doing a lot of bulk orders for, email me, John, JOHN at changingthegameproject.com so we can get that turned over. The closer we get to the holidays, the longer the printer takes to print books. And so if you want to do this, now is the perfect time to get those turned around quickly. Okay. So get ready, everyone. Buckle in. Matt Kaiser, Global Sports Advocates, and the Safesport Scaries. Enjoy, everyone. Thank you all for listening. Thanks again to Matt Kaiser. Go to globalsportsadvocates.com or just Google them. You can learn about Matt. You can learn about the work they do. And sadly, whether you are representing a victim in one of these things or someone falsely accused, you can reach out to them as well. And as Matt advises, get legal help right out of the gate, regardless of where you are in this. Thanks again to Sprocket Sports, to our Patreon podcast champions. If you want to get a little dose of the good stuff from us, we have a weekly newsletter, or probably bi-weekly newsletter, called Wednesday Wisdom, where we talk about our upcoming podcasts, we release our blogs and things like that. So if that interests you, just go to changingthegameproject.com and you can sign up right there to get that. All right. Remember, everybody, your influence is never neutral. So go out there, change the world, make a difference this week, because if you're a coach, you matter and you're changing lives every single day. So go out and do it well. We'll see you again next week.